Alright, let's go. Number 12. The Nebra Skydisk. It is a plate of bronze about the width of a dinner plate, roughly 32 centimeters across, weathered to a deep blue-green, and inlaid with shapes cut from thin gold. A full circle, a crescent, a scatter of small dots, and among them a tight little cluster of 7. 2 curved bands run along the rim, and a single arc crosses the bottom. Held in the hand, it weighs about 2 kilograms. Looked at directly, it is the oldest concrete image of the sky that survives anywhere on Earth. It came out of the ground in the summer of 1999, and not through an excavation. 2 men with a metal detector were digging illegally on the Mittelberg, a wooded hilltop near the town of Nebra in central Germany, when they struck it. The disc came up alongside 2 bronze swords, 2 axes, a chisel, and a pair of spiral armbands, and it was chipped as it was levered out of the soil. The men sold it into the black market. For 3 years, it passed through the hands of dealers, its price climbing until German authorities arranged a sting and recovered it in a hotel basement in Basel, Switzerland, in 2002. Only then could the questions begin. The other objects in the hoard were unmistakably Bronze Age, and the metal placed the disc in the same world, around 1600 BC, the work of a farming society that archaeologists call the Unitas culture. Birch bark preserved in the hilt of one of the swords was radiocarbon dated to roughly the same window. Chemical analysis traced the raw materials across a continent. The copper had come from the Eastern Alps. The gold and the tin had come from Cornwall, in Britain, hundreds of kilometers away. The importance of the object is not its age alone. It is that the disc is not decoration. It is an instrument. The 2 golden arcs along the edges mark the angle between the points where the sun rises and sets across the year, the span between the summer and winter solstices, measured at the exact latitude where the disc was buried. The cluster of 7 dots is almost certainly the Pleiades, the star group that in that part of Europe rises and vanishes, in step with the farming calendar. Someone had watched the horizon for years, marked what they saw, and pressed it into metal. One interpretation even reads a rule in its geometry for keeping a moon-based calendar in step with the sun, judged by the width of the crescent set against the 7 stars. If that is right, it is not only a picture of the sky, but a tool for keeping time. For a while, its date was challenged. In 2020, 2 researchers argued the disk belonged not to the Bronze Age, but to the Iron Age, more than 1,000 years later. Other scientists answered with the isotope chemistry and the manufacturing technique, and the Bronze Age dating held. The disk came from a world we do not usually credit with astronomy, far from the river valley empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it shows that careful skywatching was already being done in the fields of Central Europe. The disk now sits behind glass in Halle. Looted from a hillside, damaged, nearly lost into a private collection forever, it survived. The people who read the year by it did not. Number 11. The country that lies beneath the North Sea. Between the eastern coast of Britain and the shores of Denmark and the Netherlands, the North Sea is surprisingly shallow, in places only a few dozen meters deep. For more than a century, fishing trawlers working a broad rise called the Dogger Bank have dragged up things that have no business lying on a seafloor. The teeth of mammoths, the bones of lions, bears, and wild cattle, lumps of freshwater peat, and, in 1931, a single barbed point of worked antler, a harpoon carved by a human hand, tangled in the nets from beneath the waves. At the height of the last ice age, the sea stood around 120 meters lower than it does today, because so much of the world's water was locked into ice. That shallow stretch of sea was not sea at all. It was land, a low and open plain, and at times it was larger than many modern countries. The land was given a name much later by the archaeologist Brian E. Coles, who in 1998 called it Doggerland and argued that it deserved to be treated not as a bridge people hurried across, but as a place where people lived. 10,000 years ago, it was a rich country of rivers, marshes, reed beds, lakes, and woodland. Exactly the kind of ground that Mesolithic hunter-gatherers favored, thick with fish, birds, deer, and game. it could have supported a substantial population. It may have been some of the richest land in the Europe of its day, and for thousands of years it was home. For decades, the shape of it was invisible. Then the Europe's Lost Frontiers project, led by Vincent Gaffney at the University of Bradford, began mapping the drowned surface using the seismic and sonar data collected by the oil industry. Out of that came the buried outlines of ancient rivers, the curve of old coastlines, the swell of vanished hills. A whole geography surfaced, without a single stone rising above the water. The end, for a long time, was told as a single catastrophe. Around 8,200 years ago, a colossal underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, known as the Storegga Slide, sent a tsunami racing across the North Atlantic. Its run-up reached some 20 meters in Shetland. It was cast as the final blow that drowned Doggerland in an afternoon. More recent work from the seabed cores has softened that picture. By the time the wave arrived, much of the land was already gone, swallowed slowly by rising seas over many generations, and the higher ground seems to have survived the tsunami as scattered islands for some time after. The truer story is not one wave. It is a homeland shrinking year by year within the memory of the people who lived on it. There is a harder implication buried in that shallow water. When the ice melted, the sea did not just cover Doggerland. It covered nearly every coastline where Ice Age people had gathered, because people gather at the edge of the water, and that edge is now far out and far down. Much of the human story from that period is not lost. It is submerged. The antler harpoon sits in a museum drawer. The coastline it was thrown from is gone, and along the Dogger Bank, fishermen still occasionally haul up the bones of a country no one remembers. Number 10. The Antikythera mechanism. In the spring of 1900, a boat of sponge divers from the Greek island of Symi took shelter from a storm behind a tiny island called Antikythera, between Crete and the mainland. When the weather cleared, they dived, and on the seabed, 45 meters down, they found a wreck. A Roman-era cargo ship that had gone down around 65 BC, its hold heavy with bronze and marble statues, glassware, jewelry, and coins. The recovery that followed, watched over by a gunboat of the Greek Navy, became the first major underwater archaeological operation in history. Among the treasures brought up was a shapeless lump of corroded bronze, unremarkable beside the statues. It sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, ignored until 1902, when it cracked apart on its own, and the museum's director, Valerios Stias, looked closer and saw something impossible in an object that old: a gear wheel. Inside the lump were the remains of at least 30 interlocking bronze gears, cut with fine teeth, arranged in trains. It was a machine. Turned by a hand crank on the side, it modeled the heavens. Over more than a century of study, and especially through X-ray scanning, researchers slowly worked out what it did. In 2005, a team using a purpose-built 8-ton X-ray tomography machine peered inside the fragments and revealed thousands of tiny Greek inscriptions hidden on the corroded surfaces, an instruction manual etched into the metal itself. In 2021, a group at University College London, led by Tony Freeth, published a full reconstruction of the front display. The device predicted eclipses using a Babylonian cycle of 223 lunar months. It tracked the irregular motion of the moon, speeding and slowing across the sky, through a clever pairing of gears. It showed the positions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets known to the Greeks, and it marked the calendar and the timing of the athletic games. It is, by scholarly consensus, the oldest known analog computer in the world. The detail on it is almost unnerving. A dial on the front carried the sun and moon through the zodiac and the calendar. On the back, 2 great spiral dials tracked longer rhythms, a 19-year cycle that reconciles the months with the seasons, and the eclipse cycle itself, its little glyphs marking when a shadow would fall, and whether it would be the sun or the moon that darkened. A small subsidiary dial even counted down the 4-year cycle of the athletic games, naming the Olympics among them. This was a portable model of the heavens as the Greeks understood them, and it worked. What makes this difficult is not that the mechanism exists. It is what came after it, which was nothing. No object of comparable mechanical complexity appears anywhere on Earth for more than 1,000 years, until the geared astronomical clocks of medieval Europe. And yet it was not quite alone in its own time. About a century after the ship went down, the Roman writer Cicero described a bronze device built by Archimedes that modeled the motions of the sun, moon, and planets, and another owned by his friend Posidonius. Those machines are gone. This one survived, which tells us the mechanism was not a freak, but the last visible trace of a whole tradition of Greek instrument making that has otherwise vanished. A workshop somewhere in the Greek world could cut hundreds of bronze teeth to precise ratios and combine the cycles of the sky in metal, and then that skill disappeared from the record, leaving one waterlogged survivor. The fragments sit in Athens today, still being studied. The divers who found them never understood what they had pulled from the sea. And the deeper question the mechanism raises has no answer. How much else was built by hands like these and melted down and lost, leaving no trace at all? Number 9. The footprints that were too old. Pressed into pale gypsum on the floor of a dried-out basin are human footprints with clear heels, arches and toes, flat-footed, the tracks of people who did not wear shoes. One set records a small drama. A person is following a giant ground sloth. The sloth's tracks show it rearing onto its hind legs and turning, as if to face whatever was behind it. The prints lie at White Sands, in the Tularosa Basin of New Mexico, along the shore of a lake that no longer exists, called Lake Otero. They were noticed in 2009 and excavated a decade later by a team from Bournemouth University working with the United States National Park Service. 61 prints were found across 7 layers of sediment, laid down over roughly 2,000 years, alongside the tracks of mammoths, dire wolves, and the great sloths. One trackway tells of a person carrying a small child, setting it down now and then, and picking it up again, the little prints appearing and vanishing beside the adults. These are not the leftovers of a camp. They are moments, frozen in mud that dried, was buried, and turned to stone. In 2021, the team dated the layers using seeds from an aquatic plant found in the same sediment and reached a startling conclusion. The prints were between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. That placed people in the heart of North America during the last glacial maximum, the coldest peak of the Ice Age, thousands of years before the widely accepted date for human arrival, which held that people came south around 13 to 16,000 years ago. The claim was immediately attacked, and the objection was reasonable. Aquatic plants can absorb old carbon from lake water, which would make the seeds and the prints seem older than they were. So the researchers went back and dated the layers again by other means. They isolated tens of thousands of grains of conifer pollen from terrestrial plants, which do not have that problem, and dated those. They measured how long buried quartz grains had been hidden from sunlight. Both methods returned the same answer as the seeds. A later study dating mud cores from the site agreed again. In total, dozens of samples now support the range. Not everyone is convinced, and a few specialists still hold that the dates may run too old. But 3 independent lines of evidence point to the same deep age. For most of the last century, the textbook answer was clear. The first Americans were the Clovis people, big game hunters who spread south around 13,000 years ago after an ice-free corridor opened through Canada. The White Sands prints sit thousands of years before that, at a time when the corridor was closed and the ice was at its greatest. If people were already here, they must have come earlier, and by another way, perhaps down the Pacific coast by boat. And because the prints were laid down across 7 layers over many centuries, this was not one lost band passing through. People returned to that lakeshore, generation after generation, and then their presence there ended. The problem the footprints create does not go away easily. If the dates are right, people were living far south of the ice sheets at the coldest point of the Ice Age, which means the story of how and when the Americas were first peopled does not fit the evidence in the ground. There are no tools here, and no bones. No population has been firmly tied to them, only the tracks. Among them, a set of small prints runs beside a set of larger ones. A child walking with an adult across the mud of a vanished lake. On an ordinary day, more than 20,000 years ago, going somewhere we will never know. Number 8. The human who stood barely a meter tall. The skull is small enough to cup in 2 hands, with a brain case about the size of a grapefruit, and heavy brow ridges over the eyes. It belonged to an adult woman who stood roughly 1 meter and 5 centimeters tall, and it is the most complete specimen of one of the strangest members of the human family ever found. She was uncovered in 2003 in Liang Bua, a large cave on the Indonesian island of Flores, by a team led by the Australian archaeologist Mike Morwood, working with Thomas Sutena and later Peter Brown, who had come to the island searching for traces of the first modern humans on the road to Australia. What the trowel struck instead, 6 meters down, was something else entirely. When the find was published in the journal Nature in 2004, it was given the name Homo floresiensis and a nickname that stuck, the Hobbit. Her brain was close to the size of a chimpanzee's, and yet the cave floor around her held stone tools and the butchered bones of a dwarf elephant called Stegodon that these people had hunted. Her feet, wrists, and jaw were more primitive than those of any human of the last million years, closer to far older ancestors. She was not simply a small modern person. She was something older, wearing a body shaped by an island. And that raises the first hard question: how her ancestors reached the island at all. Flores lies east of a deep water boundary, a chain of channels that has never been bridged by land, even when sea levels fell to their lowest. Elephants swam it, but a hominin arriving on Flores had to cross open ocean, deliberately or by accident, hundreds of thousands of years before anyone believed early humans could manage such a thing. The dates unsettled the picture further. At first, the skeleton was thought to be only about 18,000 years old, alarmingly recent. A careful reassessment of the cave layers in 2016 pushed the bones back to between 60 and 100,000 years, with the species present until roughly 50,000 years ago, which is close to the time our own kind was arriving in this corner of the world. For a while, some argued the little skeleton was just a diseased modern human, an individual with a growth disorder. That explanation has largely fallen away. And then, at a site called Mata Menga, about 70 kilometers to the east, researchers found even older fossils, some 700,000 years old, of hominins that were smaller still, showing that the shrinking had happened early and deep in the island's past. Among those ancient fossils is a fragment of an upper arm bone, the smallest adult humerus known in the entire human record, from a creature smaller even than the hobbits. Stone tools on Flores go back around 1 million years. Exactly which ancestor gave rise to them is still argued. One view holds that a normal-sized Homo erectus reached the island and shrank over generations, the same island dwarfism that miniaturized the elephants. Another holds that they descend from something more primitive still, a hominin that left Africa before Erectus did. The bones do not yet settle it. What makes this significant is what it says about the shape of our family tree. It was not a single ladder climbing toward us. It was a branching thicket, and for a very long time, more than one kind of human walked the earth at the same time. On Flores, evolution took an elephant and made it small, took a lizard and made it enormous, and took a human being and reduced it to the height of a child. The tiny skeleton now rests in Jakarta. The hobbits were still on their island, hunting in the forest, when people who looked like us reached the region. Then they were gone, and we were the only humans left standing. Number 7. Göbekli Tepe. On a bare limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey stand rings of massive stone pillars, cut in the shape of a capital T, some more than 5 meters tall and weighing many tons. Their broad faces are carved in relief with foxes, snakes, vultures, wild boar, and scorpions, and a few are shaped into stylized human figures with arms and hands wrapping around the stone. They were raised by people who had no metal, no pottery, no writing, and no wheel. The largest pillars are not simply posts. With their arms carved in low relief, their belted waists, and their T-shaped heads, many researchers read them as bodies, stylized beings, or ancestors standing in a ring and facing inward, gathered around the two tallest at the center. The animals crawl across them like a bestiary of the surrounding world, and they are not the gentle creatures of a farmyard, but predators and scavengers, things with teeth and stingers and beaks. The site was noted in a survey in 1963 and dismissed as an old cemetery. In 1994, the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt recognized what the protruding slabs really were and began systematic excavations the following year, work he continued until his sudden death in 2014. Radiocarbon dating placed the great enclosures at around 9,600 BC, roughly 11,500 years ago. That is about 6,000 years before Stonehenge, and it is before farming, before the domestication of animals, before the founding of the first villages in the region. That was the shock. Monumental architecture was supposed to be the achievement of settled agricultural societies, the product of cities with surplus food and organized labor. Göbekli Tepe reversed the order. Here were multi-ton pillars, quarried, carved, and raised by hunter-gatherers. Schmidt argued the enclosures were the world's first temples, gathering places for people who still lived off wild plants and game, and he summed up his idea in a single line. First came the temple, then the city. In his reading, it was shared belief and ritual, the impulse to come together that drew people to settle in one place, and settlement in turn led to farming. But here's where the picture has grown more complicated. Under Schmidt's successor, Lee Clare, the team dug deeper than before and found things Schmidt had not seen. Evidence of houses, of a cistern, and channels for collecting rainwater on the dry hilltop, and thousands of grinding tools for processing grain, perhaps for porridge and for beer. Göbekli Tepe may not have been an isolated sanctuary visited on special occasions, but a settlement in its own right, with these enormous buildings at its heart. Even the old idea that the enclosures were deliberately buried at the end has been questioned. Much of the fill may be natural. Whatever its exact function, the central fact stands. People with no kings, no bureaucracy, and no agriculture, as we understand it, organized themselves to quarry, carve, and lift stones that would tax a modern crew, and they did it again and again over centuries. The scale of the effort is hard to overstate. Moving and raising a single pillar would have taken many people pulling together, and the animal bones scattered across the site, tens of thousands of them, all from wild species like aurochs and gazelle, suggest large gatherings and feasting. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the surrounding hills of southeastern Turkey, archaeologists have now found a whole cluster of related sites of the same age, including one called Karahan Tepe with its own carved pillars. This was not a single freak monument. It was a landscape of them. What drew these people together, and what the animals on the pillars meant to them, we do not know. Most of the hill has never been dug. Ground surveys show around 20 of these great enclosures still waiting beneath the surface, sealed in the earth. The stones remain. The beliefs that raised them are gone. Number 6. The oldest drawing ever found. It is a small flake of a fine-grained stone called silkrete, about the size of a thumb, and on one smooth face there are 9 lines drawn in red ochre. 6 of them run roughly parallel. 3 more cross them at an angle. That is all. It is a deliberate, geometric pattern made by pressing an ochre crayon against groundstone, and it is the earliest known drawing made by a human being. It came from Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, about 300 kilometers east of Cape Town, a site excavated since the mid-1990s by Christopher Henshelwood and his colleagues. The flake was recovered from layers dated to around 73,000 years ago and reported in the journal Nature in 2018. To understand why a few crossed lines matter, Consider what they overturned. For a long time, the earliest evidence of art and symbolic thought was placed in Europe around 40,000 years ago, with the Great Painted Caves. This drawing is more than 30,000 years older than that, and it is not in Europe. It is in Africa, made by early members of our own species. Blombos is not an isolated marvel. Along the same South African coast and beyond, other sites tell the same story. From a shelter called Diepkloof came pieces of ostrich eggshell, older than 55,000 years, engraved with careful geometric bands. What the record seems to show is not a single moment when the human mind switched on, but a capacity that appears, fades, and appears again across the deep past, flickering in and out of the evidence long before it settled in for good. And it does not stand alone. What makes this significant is the pattern of behavior around it. In the same cave, in slightly older layers, archaeologists found pieces of ochre engraved with cross-hatched designs, dated to around 77,000 years. They found perforated seashells that appear to have been strung as beads. And in layers around 100,000 years old, they found something remarkable: a workshop for making paint. 2 abalone shells used as containers, still holding a red ochre compound, along with the tools for grinding and mixing it and bone for adding fat. These people were not just marking stone. They were planning, storing, decorating, and making things that stood for other things. Red ochre runs through the whole story of this cave. More than 8,000 pieces of it were recovered from the Middle Stone Age layers, many showing wear from being deliberately ground down and used. Ochre can be practical, a component of glue, a sunscreen, a treatment for hides. But the care taken here, the grinding, the storing in shells, the marks cut into it, points beyond the merely useful towards something closer to meaning and display. The beads matter as much as the drawing. To pierce a shell, thread it, and wear it is to send a signal, to say something about who you are to others who can read the code, and that is symbolic behavior in the fullest sense. The tools from these layers are not crude either. The people of Blombos shaped stone with a technique called pressure flaking, pressing off tiny flakes to finish fine points, a method that does not appear again for many thousands of years. Their world was one of pigment, ornament, planning, and craft. The lines on the flake break off at its edges. That tells us the pattern, once continued onto a larger surface, that this flake is a fragment of something bigger. What the full design was, and what it meant to the person who drew it, is lost. The hand that held the crayon belonged to someone anatomically like us, with a brain like ours, living an Ice Age life on a coast at the bottom of the world. The mind that could hold a symbol, that abstract, unmistakably human capacity, was already here, tens of thousands of years earlier than we once believed. The flake sits in a laboratory in Cape Town, 9 red lines on a broken piece of stone. Number 5. The eruption that was supposed to end us. Roughly 74,000 years ago, on the island of Sumatra, the volcano Toba erupted in one of the largest eruptions the Earth has seen in the last 2.5 million years. It emptied a magma chamber so vast that the ground collapsed into a caldera now filled by a lake nearly 100 kilometers long. Ash rained across South Asia, and a layer of Toba's volcanic glass can still be found in the ground from India to the floor of the South China Sea. The numbers are staggering. Toba threw out on the order of 2,500 cubic kilometers of rock and ash, hundreds of times more than the eruption that buried Pompeii, enough to blanket parts of India in ash meters deep and to loft sulfur high into the atmosphere, where it can veil the sun and cool the planet for years. The scale is difficult to picture. For much of the last 30 years, a dramatic story attached itself to that eruption. It held that Toba plunged the world into a volcanic winter lasting years, that the cold and darkness collapsed ecosystems, and that our species was pushed to the edge of extinction, its numbers crashing to only a few thousand survivors. The idea was set out most forcefully in the late 1990s by the archaeologist Stanley Ambrose, and for a time it was widely repeated, a single volcano that nearly ended the human experiment. It drew support from genetics. Our species carries surprisingly little genetic diversity, which suggests that at some point, the human population passed through a narrow bottleneck, and the timing seemed, at first, to line up with Toba. The problem is that the evidence has not held together. In southern India, at a site called Jwalapuram, stone tools lie both below and above the Toba ash layer, showing that people were living there before the eruption and still living there afterward. The archaeologist Michael Petraglia, who led the work at Jwalapuram, has argued that the people there were barely interrupted. In South Africa, at Pinnacle Point on the coast, humans not only survived the period, but appear to have kept innovating, and the record of shellfish gathering, tool-making, and pigment use continues across the eruption, almost as if nothing had changed. Repeated genetic studies have failed to find a population crash that coincides cleanly with the eruption, and detailed climate modeling has scaled back the estimated cooling by a large margin. The genetic story turned out to be subtler too. The low diversity in our DNA reflects what is called effective population size, a statistical figure that can be far smaller than the actual number of people alive, and the faint signal of a bottleneck in the human genome is old and does not line up neatly with the eruption. Populations expand and contract for many reasons, over long stretches of time, and reading a single catastrophe out of that record was, it turned out, a mistake. Many researchers now regard the near-extinction version of the story as unsupported. Toba was a genuine catastrophe, one of the great convulsions of the planet's recent history. But the more the record is examined, the less it looks like the moment our species was almost erased, and the more it looks like evidence of how stubbornly people endured. The bottleneck in our genes may well be real. Its cause and its timing are no longer so certain, and Toba is no longer the obvious answer. The lake fills the crater now, calm and enormous. The ash layer still runs through the sediment on 2 continents, a clear line marking the day the sky darkened. And the disaster that was supposed to have nearly ended, it looks, on the evidence in the ground, more like a story of survival. Number 4. The grave that was filled with flowers. In 1960, in a cave in the mountains of northern Iraq, a team lifted the crushed remains of a Neanderthal man out of the earth in a solid block of surrounding soil. When the soil was later analyzed, it was found to be unusually dense with pollen, clumps of it from flowering plants. That skeleton, known as Shanidar IV, became one of the most famous burials in the study of human origins. The cave is Shanidar, set into the flank of Bradost Mountain in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, about 800 kilometers north of Baghdad. Between 1951 and 1960, the archaeologist Ralph Selecki excavated the remains of 10 Neanderthals there. One of them, an older man archaeologist nicknamed Nandi, had survived a catalog of devastating injuries. He had been blind in one eye. His arm was withered and partly lost. He had suffered a crushing blow to the side of the head and likely severe hearing loss. And he had lived on for years in that state, which could only have been possible if others in his group had cared for and fed him. A person that impaired, in that landscape, does not survive alone. His body is one of the strongest cases in all of prehistory for compassion among Neanderthals, for the idea that the injured were kept, not abandoned. Then there were the flowers. From the pollen around Shanidar IV, the analyst Arlette Leroy-Gourhan proposed that the man had been deliberately buried with flowering plants laid upon his body, an act of ceremony and grief. It was a powerful image. Neanderthals, long dismissed as brutish, mourning their dead with blossoms, and it reshaped how the public saw them. The find landed in the 1960s, at the very moment the world was beginning to reconsider who Neanderthals had been, and it became a symbol, quoted in textbooks and museums for half a century. What makes this difficult is the flowers themselves. In recent years, a re-examination of the site by researchers, including Chris Hunt and Emma Pomeroy, concluded that the clumps of pollen were most likely brought in by nesting solitary bees, or by burrowing animals, rather than by mourners. The bouquet, as evidence, may dissolve. None of this arrives out of nowhere. The old caricature of Neanderthals as dim-witted brutes has been steadily dismantled. We now know they made and wore ornaments from eagle talons and shells, used red and black pigment, and in one French cave called Bruniquel, built strange rings out of broken stalagmites deep underground, nearly 200,000 years ago. Whether or not they ever laid flowers, they were a species capable of far more than bare survival. But the deeper finding does not. A new campaign of excavations by a Cambridge-led team, including Graham Barker, Tim Reynolds, and Emma Pomeroy, working between roughly 2015 and 2020, uncovered another individual close to the old finds, a skeleton they called Shanidar Z, more than 70,000 years old. The bodies had been placed against and behind a large upright boulder that would have stood out on the cave floor like a marker, a fixed point in the dark. The positioning does not look random. It looks chosen. And what emerged from the pattern of the bodies is that the Neanderthals of Shanidar had returned to the same spot, again and again, to place their dead. Whether or not there were ever flowers, they came back to one place for one purpose. The distinction matters more than it first appears. A single grave could be an accident of geology, a place used repeatedly across many lifetimes. To hold the dead is something else. It implies memory and the handing down of a custom from one generation to the next, among a kind of human that was not us. Shanidar Z's flattened skull was lifted out in pieces and is still being studied in the laboratory. The flowers are uncertain. The gathering of the dead in one place is not. Number 3. The small-brained cousin that may have buried its dead. Deep inside a cave system near Johannesburg, a passage narrows to a vertical chute barely 18 centimeters wide at its tightest squeeze, a gap most adults could not force their bodies through. At the bottom, in a chamber reached only through that crack in the rock, lies a dense scatter of bones. They belong to a species of human relative that almost no one expected to find. 2 recreational cavers, Stephen Tucker and Rick Hunter, had squeezed into the chamber in 2013 and photographed the bones. The paleoanthropologist Lee Berger, realizing that no one on his own team could fit through the 18-centimeter gap, advertised for excavators small and thin enough to do it, and assembled a group of 6 slender scientists, all women, who became known as the underground astronauts. They dug in a chamber they could reach only by crawling, climbing, and squeezing through the dark. In 2015, the species was named Homo naledi. The remains of more than 15 individuals have been recovered, of every age. Their anatomy is a strange mosaic. Hands and feet close to our own, but shoulders and a chest shaped more like far older ancestors, and a brain only about 1/3 the size of a modern human's. Later, dating delivered another surprise. When the fossils were first found, many assumed a species this primitive-looking, with so small a brain, had to be 2 or 3 million years old. The dates, when they finally came, told a different story. These were recent creatures, contemporaries of the first people who looked like us, living only about 250 to 300,000 years ago. A small-brained hominin had persisted deep into the age of our own kind. The central puzzle is how the bones came to rest so deep in the cave. To reach that chamber, a body, living or dead, had to pass through that brutal chute in total darkness. Berger's team proposed an extraordinary answer, that Homo naledi deliberately carried its dead into the depths and left them there. And in 2023, they went further still, claiming evidence of intentional burials dug into the chamber floor, of geometric lines engraved on the cave walls, and of the use of fire. What makes this contested is the size of the claim measured against the strength of the evidence. The 2023 findings were released as preprints, before formal peer review, and timed with a streaming documentary. The reviews that followed were severe. In one case, the reviewers were unanimous that the evidence, as presented, did not support the conclusion. The burials are not established, and many researchers remain unconvinced. The critics do not deny that the bones are there, or that reaching the chamber is hard. They argue that other explanations have not been ruled out, that bodies or bones could have washed in through openings during floods, or fallen in and gathered over long periods, or entered through a shaft that was once easier to pass than it is now. The team's central piece of physical evidence, a claim that the sediment around the skeletons had been disturbed by digging, was disputed by later specialists who reanalyzed it and found no clear sign of a grave. And yet, even the possibility matters. For a long time, the treatment of the dead with intention and the making of marks that carry meaning were assumed to require a large brain like ours. If a creature with a third of our brain volume did anything of the kind, then the neat link between big brains and complex behavior comes loose, and the line we like to draw around what makes us special begins to blur. The safer conclusion is the one that is not in dispute, that a previously unknown kind of human, small-brained and strange, lies deep in the dark of that cave, in a place that is difficult to reach for any reason. Whether it put itself there is the question that remains open. What is certain is remarkable enough on its own. What is claimed on top of it would be extraordinary, and extraordinary claims are exactly the ones that must survive the hardest scrutiny before they are believed. The bones are still down there. The chute is still narrow. Number 2, the year the connected world came apart. There is a clay tablet from the city of Ugarit on the coast of Syria that was never sent. It is a letter from the king, and it reports that enemy ships have appeared, that they are burning his towns and doing terrible harm to his land. The tablet was found in a kiln, waiting to be fired, and the city was destroyed around it. It is, in effect, a message from the last days of a world. Around 1200 BC, the eastern Mediterranean stood at a peak of wealth and connection. Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire, ruling from its capital at Hattusa in Anatolia, the new kingdom of Egypt, the merchant cities of Cyprus and the Levant, all were bound together by trade in metal, grain, and luxury. A single merchant ship wrecked off the Turkish coast at Uluburun, dating to the 14th century BC, carried copper from Cyprus, tin from far to the east, and goods from a dozen different cultures in one hold. It was a globalized age. Kings wrote to one another as brothers. Egyptian gold flowed north, Baltic amber flowed south, and copper and tin from distant mines met in the bronze that armed every palace. A diplomatic letter could travel from the Nile to Anatolia, and the same gods, styles, and luxuries turned up in courts 1,000 kilometers apart. Within roughly 50 years, most of it was gone. City after city was burned. Palaces were abandoned. The Hittite Empire simply vanished. Writing itself lapsed. The script the Mycenaeans had used, which we call Linear B, disappears from the record, and a dark age of several centuries closes over the Aegean and the Near East. The list of the fallen reads like a roll call of the age. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was abandoned and burned. Mycenae and the great citadel of Pylos in Greece went up in flames. A clay tablet baked hard in the fire of Pylos records watchers posted to guard the coast, a last order given as the end came on. Ugarit was destroyed and never lived in again. City after city shows the same thing in its final layer: burning, collapse, and then silence. The traditional villain is a shadowy force the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples, coalitions of raiders who struck by land and sea and who are carved into the walls of the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. Egypt claimed to have defeated them in a great battle in 1177 BC at a cost that left the kingdom exhausted. But who the Sea Peoples were and where they came from is one of the oldest unsolved questions in the field. But here's where the single cause story breaks down. The evidence points not to one enemy, but to a cascade of failures, striking a system already stretched thin. Pollen cores from the Dead Sea and the wider Levant record a severe, decades-long drought. The scholar Eric Klein and the geophysicist Amos Nur have identified a cluster of powerful earthquakes rippling across the region between 1225 and 1175 BC, an earthquake storm. The trade routes that carried the tin and copper needed to make bronze faltered, and with them, the technological edge of the palaces. Letters from Ugarit begged neighbors for grain, and the sea peoples themselves may have been as much refugees as raiders. Whole populations, driven from their own collapsing homelands into someone else's. The lesson is not that one thing killed them. It is that a tightly interconnected world can be more fragile than a scattered one. The very thing that made these civilizations rich, their dependence on one another, was also the thing that let the failure of one region pull down the rest, faster than anyone could adapt. What followed was a genuine dark age. In Greece, writing was lost so completely that when the Greeks learned to write again centuries later, they did it with a new alphabet, and the palaces of the Bronze Age faded into the half-remembered legends that Homer would one day sing. Populations shrank. Trade withered. It would be centuries before the Eastern Mediterranean recovered, and the world that rose afterward, with its iron tools and its emerging city-states, was a different one. The unsent tablet from Ugarit survives, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the city. The sea peoples were never identified, and at excavation after excavation across the Eastern Mediterranean, the same feature appears in the ground. A single dark band of destruction. The burned remains of a connected world, running like a line through the earth. It took only a few decades to lay down that line, and the people who lived through it did not know they were standing inside the end of an age. Number 1. The Denisovans. It begins with the tip of a child's little finger. In 2008, in a cave in the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia, researchers recovered a bone fragment so small it could rest on a fingernail. The cave is called Denisova, named by us after a hermit named Denis, who is said to have sheltered there in the 18th century. The bone lay in a layer tens of thousands of years old, and when its DNA was read in 2010, it matched nothing known. It was not Neanderthal. It was not modern human. It belonged to a previously unknown branch of humanity, and because we had nothing else to call them, we named them after the cave. Think about what that means. Here was an entire population of ancient humans, discovered not from a skull or a skeleton, but from a strand of DNA inside a sliver of bone. For years, that was almost all we had. The finger, a couple of teeth, later, a jawbone from the high Tibetan plateau, and a single tooth from a cave in Laos. No face, no complete skull, a whole kind of human, defined by their genome, and by almost nothing you could look at. Yet, the DNA and those few scattered fossils told us they had been almost everywhere. Their remains and their genetic traces stretch from that Siberian cave across the roof of Asia to the Tibetan plateau, down into the caves of Laos, and out toward the coasts of the Pacific. They endured the bitter cold of the north and the thin air of high altitude, and they lasted a very long time, until perhaps 30,000 years ago, close enough to the present that our own ancestors shared the world with them for tens of thousands of years. And yet we knew they were not truly gone, because they are inside living people. As our own ancestors spread out of Africa, they met Denisovans and had children with them, and that inheritance survives today. The peoples of New Guinea and Aboriginal Australia carry the most, up to around 5% of their entire genome. Populations across East and South Asia and the Americas carry smaller traces, and some of that ancient DNA is not idle. The gene that allows Tibetans to breathe and thrive at extreme altitude on the roof of the world where most people struggle was inherited from Denisovans. Genes that appear to help Arctic populations tolerate cold seem to have come from them as well, and other fragments of Denisovan inheritance appear to help modern immune systems recognize and fight disease. A vanished people were still shaping the bodies of the living. There is one bone from the Siberian cave that captures the whole strange intimacy of it. A fragment belonging to a girl who died around 90,000 years ago yielded a genome that was almost exactly half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation child of two different kinds of human, Two vanished species meeting in a single body. And she is not a legend or a reconstruction. She is a splinter of bone with a genome we have read. And then in 2025, the face arrived. There is a massive fossil skull that was found in 1933 in the city of Harbin, in northeastern China, and then hidden for decades at the bottom of a well before it was recovered in 2018. It had been given its own species name, Homo longi, and a nickname, Dragon Man. A team led by the geneticist Chao Mei-Fu scraped a tiny amount of hardened plaque from one of its teeth, extracted DNA and ancient proteins from that trace, and found the match they had been searching for. The Dragon Man was a Denisovan. After 15 years of knowing them only as code, we could finally look at one. A heavy brow, a broad and powerful face, and a brain case as large as our own. Some questions remain open about the naming and about which of the scattered Asian fossils truly belong to them, but the ghost had been given a face. Here is the largest fact of this entire list, the one the others have been circling. Not very long ago, in the deep scale of our story, ours was not the only kind of human on Earth. Neanderthals held the West. Denisovans held the East. The tiny hobbits lived on their island. A small-brained cousin walked in the South. For most of the human story, the planet carried several kinds of people at once, meeting, mixing, and passing in the same landscapes. Today it carries one. We are what is left. It is easy to picture our species as the inevitable endpoint of the story, the one that was always meant to be here. The deeper record says otherwise. We are one surviving branch of a bush that was once crowded, the last of several kinds of human, and the reason we are the ones still standing is not fully understood, and still the others did not fully disappear. They are in us. If your ancestry runs through Asia, the Pacific, or the Americas, you almost certainly carry Denisovan DNA in your cells right now. A few thousand fragments of a people who built no monument, wrote no word, spoke a language no one recorded, and had no name of their own until we gave them one. For a decade and a half, everything we knew of them came from a smudge of genetic code in the fingertip of a child who died in a Siberian cave. They are gone. And they are also, quietly, still here, in the blood of billions of living people, and in that sliver of finger bone lying in a drawer. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.